Hello BookTube and welcome to the Literary Buffet. My name is Louis and today I'm emulating a video that was published by Life on Books this week. Life on Books is a podcast by Tony and Andy. Every week they get together, they talk about what they're currently reading. They also usually have a topic on which they then kind of like share their opinions, bookish topics typically. And this week their video was about their personal canon. And I really like that, so I decided I'll just take that as the tagline for today's video. I quite like the idea of a personal canon, even though it's kind of like an oxymoron, because obviously a canon is something that's put together by a community, so a literary community, a community of professors, of critics, etc. And a personal canon sounds like, oh, these are like your favorite books. But obviously it goes a little bit beyond that. So I think even when we talk about favorite books, we kind of like categorize them in favorite books that we just happen to like, even though we know they might not have the highest literary merit, and then others that have just been, amazing discoveries for us in terms of, what we get from them, the style that they're written in, etc. And that's kind of how Tony and Andy defined it in their video. So they described it as the 10 most influential books. I quite like the way that they did it because they split their choices in two. Each chose 5 books that they had read, and then 5 books that they hadn't yet read, but really were looking forward to read. So they were already considering them as influential. They had kind of like curated their list of what they want to read in the future, and on that basis they presented those 5 books. And so I did it in a similar way. I have 5 books of fiction that I have read, plus one that I add a non-fiction one. So Tony and Andy didn't cover non-fiction, but I decided to throw a non-fiction one here as well. And then I have 5 works of fiction I haven't read yet, plus one of non-fiction. So overall you'll have not 10 books, but 12 books of my personal canon. And to start, I have this one here. It's the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, one of the 4 classical Chinese novels. It's 4 or 6, depending on who you ask. And this is one of the older ones. So this is from the early Ming Dynasty, so 14th century, and it's attributed to Luo Guanzhong. So we don't really actually know who wrote it or how it was composed in actuality, but nevertheless Luo Guanzhong is the one that is given as the author nowadays. This version here is translated by Moss Roberts and is an abridged version, so the actual version is kind of like 4 times as big as this, but nevertheless I think it's even though I only read the abridged version, I would still consider it as part of my personal canon. And mostly because this was my introduction into classical Chinese literature. I've since read the Dream of the Red Chamber, which is fantastic. So definitely also, if this was a longer list, it would definitely also be on that one. I've started The Journey to the West, which is less of my cup of tea, let's say. But somehow my heart still goes back to the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and I'm definitely planning to read the full version at some point. So the Romance of the Three Kingdoms is actually like a literary material that was circulating in China for a long, long time, way before Luo Guanzhong actually wrote his novel. It's actually based on an episode of Chinese history at the end of the Han Dynasty, so I think around the 3rd century AD, when China became split into 3 kingdoms. One led by Liu Bei, who claimed to be the heir to the Han Dynasty, one led by Cao Cao, warlord in the north, and then one led by the Sun family. So, and the main protagonist here is Sun Quan, the main king. Basically, the novel follows the fights between these various families in order to gain supremacy over China again. So it's really a story that starts from the crumbling of the Han Dynasty and goes up until the reconstitution of China as a complete entity. And there's like a very famous quote that bookends the novel, which is stated in different ways in the novel, but it basically goes like this: the empire long united must divide, long divided must unite. And it's basically almost like a motto of the book, and it's a motto more broadly of Chinese history. And that's like the whole point, or one of the points that the author was trying to make, is China as a cultural entity, even in the times when there's upheaval, even in the times when it's maybe disorganized, it has this urge to be united again as a polity. And it's, to be honest, like a thought that is ingrained to this day in Chinese thought, of like this reunifying China, however it is defined. So from that perspective, is a novel that has influenced Chinese thought for a long time. But it also has a very, very large cultural influence in other areas. To this day, a lot of Asian video games are based on the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. And it's easy to see why, because the appeal of this novel is because you have three main kingdoms, three main protagonists. You don't really have this structure that you usually have in Western novels of you have a hero and a villain, or a group of heroes and a group of villains. Once you have three main protagonists, the interactions become much more complex and actually much more interesting. And you have, like, even though you have two main groups that are pictured in the novel, they're always like trying to vie for the third one, and then trying to get the third one to help them. So the heroes are Liu Bei and his acolytes, his band of heroes, while the antagonist is Cao Cao and his family. But because you also have Sun Quan of the Eastern Kingdom, the dynamics is very interesting and very convoluted. It's almost like, you have the famous Chinese science fiction novel, The Three-Body Problem. And so this is kind of like the three-body problem in politics. You also have a very large influence just because of the characters that are depicted in this novel, who are celebrated to this day in China. So when I was in Chengdu, a city, one of the main cities in Sichuan, which was actually the center of the kingdom of Liu Bei, so the Shu Han kingdom, you actually have the grave of Liu Bei that you can visit to this day. Nearby, you also have like statues of Zhuge Liang. So Zhuge Liang was his kind of his consigliere, so his main strategist, kind of like a savant that they found somewhere in the forest, and as an hermit who doesn't want to deal with politicians, but he then is convinced by Liu Bei to join his cause, and you have a lot of stratagems by Zhuge Liang to outwit the Caos. So from that perspective, that's also very interesting with those characters. The acolytes of Liu Bei are Zhang Fei and Guan Yu, and they also typify certain characters. So Zhang Fei is kind of like the brute, the muscle, while Guan Yu is more of the strategist on Liu Bei's side, the military strategist, so the fighter, but more of the tactician. And Guan Yu to this day is actually celebrated as a Taoist deity. So you have temples to Guan Yu in China. So all in all, it's a hugely influential novel, but it's also just a very interesting kind of novel of heroics, of battles, and stratagems. You have even of poetry. You have Cao Cao, the warlord of the north, who is also, and this is true, recognized as a poet, and one of his sons in particular is known to this day as a celebrated poet from that period. So you have his poetry that is enmeshed into the novel. So lots of things going on. Is really a wonderful novel and a wonderful introduction to classical Chinese literature. Then the next one is the Memoirs of Hadrian by Marguerite Yourcenar. So this was written in published in 1951. Marguerite Yourcenar is a famous French author, female author, and this novel is just fantastic in terms of the style, the prose that she brings in. Obviously, the erudition that she has mixed into the novel, the kind of thought that comes across as, as if Hadrian had written a memoir. So he didn't actually. So this is just Marguerite Yourcenar's invention, but it's also, to that extent, a little bit of a counterpoint to the actual memoir that has survived, which is that of Marcus Aurelius, which is this Stoic memoir. This one here is much more emotional. It focuses, as you would expect by something about the Emperor Hadrian, on Hadrian's relationship with Antinous, this boy that he found in what's today Turkey, and that becomes his lover. We don't know how much Antinous, had a chance to decide in order to consent to this relationship, if the Emperor of the Roman Empire wants you as his lover. But anyway, and spoiler, the relationship ends tragically, and obviously the aftermath then of that tragedy is also, depicted very emotionally in this novel. The reason I quite like it is because, and why I think it's in my personal canon, is really the style. I think this is the best written French book I've ever read. It's amazing. It's better than Proust, in my opinion. Take it for what it is. It's better than Zola and some of the other famous French writers. This is, for me, the best written French novel. I've seen it compared, and I think Steve Donoghue compared it to Robert Graves' I, Claudius, because obviously it's the same idea. You take a Roman emperor and then you write his memoirs. I did read I, Claudius ages ago while I was a student, and I mean, it was fine. I remember it being fine, but I don't remember it being a literary masterpiece as this one here struck me. So if you are interested in French literature, you definitely should read Marguerite Yourcenar's Memoirs of Hadrian. Then from French literature to Italian literature, we have Foucault's Pendulum by Umberto Eco, published in 1988 in Italy. And this was, for a long time, when people would ask me, what is your favorite novel? I would say Umberto Eco's Foucault's Pendulum. I read it twice as a student, and I read it again earlier this year. And it's just wonderful. Think of, kind of like these Dan Brown novels that came after this. So they came in the 90s and early 2000s, I think, whatever they were called, like Angels and Demons, etc. And think of what it could be if it was written by a literary master. And then you have Umberto Eco's Foucault's Pendulum. It's just this amazing romp through the history of secret societies, the Templars, the Masons, etc., all kind of like weaved together into this meta conspiracy that goes from the Templars to the present day, and encompassing everything in between, the Illuminati, etc. But it's more than that, because it's actually also of the dangers of getting too hung up on these mysteries, on these conspiracy theories, on these secret societies and secret knowledges and all of that thing, and how ultimately it leads to your peril and worse. So it's just wonderful. If you like The Name of the Rose, this one is even better. I wouldn't say that of all Umberto Eco's novels, so some I have struggled with, some I have DNF'd, but this one here is just magnificent. Then one that I think should be pretty well known all over BookTube, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, published in 1813. I don't think it needs any introduction. I read it last year when Steve Donoghue did his read aloud of Pride and Prejudice. And I would say it's actually quite true what he was saying, either in those videos, in that series of videos, or also in other videos of his, that men usually try to kind of like skirt Jane Austen because she has like this reputation of, well, it's kind of like a romance novel. Do you really want to read a romance novel as a man? I think Steve Donoghue would argue, of course you should. But I must confess, before actually getting into Steve's read aloud, I had a little bit the same opinion. So do I really want to read Jane Austen? But I did, and man, I mean, it's really amazingly written. I think probably the things that would appeal to a man are different than the things that would appeal to a woman. I'm just, guessing. But for me, the wit of Jane Austen's writing was just amazing. I just loved it. I loved the way that she depicted this whole society, the little mannerisms here and there, the little ironies that she would sprinkle into her writing, and then that's just fabulous. And the story is pretty good as well. So I think Pride and Prejudice, I don't think I need to add anything to it, but well, one that I found influential in the sense that it changed my opinion on certain ways of writing, of certain genres, and probably on female writers in general. Then the next one is Ficciones by Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentine author. This was published in Spanish in the 1940s and 1950s. So it's a collection of short stories that he then kind of like gathered into Ficciones, and he did this collection like several times. So it was published in different iterations of the collection. He has published many more collections of short stories, and I've read some, but for me, the best ones are definitely the ones in here in Ficciones. In general, I'm not really a big fan of short stories. I think short stories are actually a very difficult genre to get right. I actually don't understand why, when you have these writing advices and I guess like these MFA programs, from what I gather, where they teach you how to write short stories. It's a bit weird that they would try to teach you like the most difficult thing before teaching you the easier thing, which is a novel. Because the short story is obviously easy in the sense that it's a small format, so you can quickly write one. But to make a short story that really packs a punch, I think it's really difficult. That's why I actually usually don't read them. I think most of those that you come across are just, you read them and they're like, well, yeah, fine. I mean, they were just like 5 pages long, but in the end, you feel like you still wasted your time reading those 5 pages. And that's my experience with, or at least my feeling with a lot of short stories. However, Borges really manages to pack, like it's like he distills all of his erudition, all of what he would put into a novel, into a short story, like all his philosophical points that he wants to make. So I think some of these short stories that are in this book here are just iconic. I think The Library of Babel is very well known and is iconic. The Garden of Forking Paths is amazing. There's this one called the Pierre Menard, the author of the Quixote, I think it's called, where he reimagines a guy writing the Don Quixote, but in the present time. And what would it mean if, you would write exactly the same novel with exactly the same words, but in the present? Would it change anything in the interpretation of the novel? So it's a very interesting thought experiment, really. And so are basically all of his short stories in this collection. So definitely recommend, if you can get your hands on Ficciones, do it. So those were my 5 fiction books, and for the last one, I have a non-fiction canonical book, at least one in my personal canon, and it's one I don't see actually anyone talking about, so I want to feature it, and that's Civilizations by Felipe Fernandez-Armesto, and it was published in 2000, I believe. Yeah, 2000. And before telling you about this book, I need to tell you about another one, which is much more famous, and that's Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, which I was surprised to find is still, being sold like hot cookies in the bookshop here in Germany, where I saw it just a few weeks ago, where they have like their English non-fiction and history titles. It was featured prominently there. And Guns, Germs, and Steel was a kind of like a multi-million success, I believe. Jared Diamond is not a historian, but I think he was a biologist or something like that. But he tried to answer the question of why the West ended up dominating, why Europe, let's put it that way, why Europe ended up dominating first the Americas, so the Incas, etc., and later on also the rest of the world. Jared Diamond has been criticized quite a lot because some of the anecdotes he tells, or some of the science is maybe not really as well researched as you would expect from a historian. Some of the scenes that he also depicts are a bit simplistic, so I think the meeting between Atahualpa, the leader of the Incas, and then Pizarro, the conquistador from Spain. So I think some people have really criticized that that's not really what actually happened. But I think what a lot of critics of Jared Diamond fail to actually address is to provide their own answer on, okay, why did then actually Europe conquer the Americas? The one that actually explains it, and not just that, but explains why civilizations flourished in certain areas and then how they flourished in certain areas. The one who, for me, explained it the best is actually Felipe Fernandez-Armesto. So he's a British historian. And in Civilizations, what he really looks, so he takes kind of like the same premise as Jared Diamond in looking for geographic explanation, or an explanation based on biomes. And what he does is he looks at the different biomes in the world and and examines what are actually the preconditions for civilization in those parts. And his basic idea is to say, well, if you are in the Arctic, well, obviously you can't build a civilization that's that has billions, millions, or hundreds of millions of inhabitants, plus a flourishing trade network, plus the production of silk and whatnot, because the Arctic biome doesn't give you the preconditions to actually create those. And so he really moves from biome to biome, and for each biome, then he actually explains what actually a peak civilization looks like in that particular biome. So for instance, when he talks about like the jungle or the rainforest, the tropical rainforest, the one he highlights are the Maya, as basically, well, in pre-industrial societies, what the Mayas have achieved is probably the most you could achieve. So you shouldn't expect the Mayas to have developed the kind of technology that we had in medieval Europe, because the biome, tropical rainforest, didn't allow the Mayan society to progress beyond where they progressed. But for the biome that they were living in, their achievement was spectacular. So that's kind of like the gist of civilizations. So it's really interesting for anyone who likes actually global history, and understanding how different civilizations flourished and where they flourished, etc., why they flourished. This is really a great book. It's probably, from a historical perspective, a better book than Jared Diamond's book. And even though it doesn't not fully cover the question of why did Europe conquer the rest of the world, it does offer a much better grounding to think about this question. So then, moving on to the books that are in my personal canon as books that I think are very influential and that I'm really looking forward to read at some point, but that I haven't read yet. And I have some additional props also for those. So I'll start first with this one here. Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus, published in 1947. Let me put this here. Published in 1947, and it's Thomas Mann's reimagination of the Faust mythos, but putting it in pre-Nazi and Nazi Germany, and it's really a reflection on art versus authoritarianism, the Nazi regime, etc. In this case, he follows a composer, and so a musical composer is more of a musical type of novel. That's why you have a metronome here. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to reading this. I did read the much more famous Magic Mountain. So there's the German version in a recent edition with lots of snow on it. And the Magic Mountain is just fantastic. It's the best written German book I've read ever. And so I have quite high expectations on Dr. Faustus. Obviously, Dr. Faustus is a subject that has been treated by quite a lot of authors. Most famous, or one of the most famous, is Goethe's Johann Wolfgang von Goethe and his Faust. We did read Faust Part 1 in high school, and I really liked it. So at that time, even though it's a poem, basically it's kind of like a play, but written in verse. It's extremely well written in German. Obviously, it's Goethe. We didn't read Part 2 because Part 2 was considered too experimental or exotic for poor high school students. But we did read Act 5 of Part 2, because Act 5 of Part 2 is the conclusion of the whole Faust saga, and you kind of like needed that to have a resolution to the whole to all the themes that Goethe was doing here. And but yeah, so obviously Thomas Mann, when he decided to also cover the Faust theme, was quite ambitious, because I mean, he was basically stepping into the steps of the greatest German author, at least until Thomas Mann, who was Goethe. And yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Actually, the reason I've added Faust in my video today is just because earlier this morning I watched a fantastic deep dive into the whole Faust mythos by Angela Collier. She's a physicist, but she also talks about books from time to time. I'll post or I'll link to her video below. It's fantastic. So she looks at all the Faust novels that have or books that have been published, including this one. And so go and watch her video. It's really great. And then staying in Germany, I have a book that echoes what Tony and Andy had in their video. I don't remember who exactly had it. I think it might have been Andy. And that's Hermann Broch's The Death of Virgil, published 1945, so around the same period as the other one. And it deals with the last few days of Virgil before he dies. Broch was an Austrian author. He was briefly imprisoned by the Austrian Nazis, and then he fled, and this was published in 1945 while he was in exile. And it's considered one of the masterpieces of German literature. I don't know much more about it, except that it's kind of like a modernist work, I believe. But I'm quite intrigued by it, so I'll look forward to reading it. Then we're staying more or less in the same timeline, so a lot of my recommendations are from roughly the same time, or not my recommendations, my canonical books that I still have to read. And this is the Makioka sisters by Tanizaki, so Jun'ichiro Tanizaki. This was published also in the 1940s, so it was serialized from 43 to 48 in Japan. So an interesting time period in Japan, one could say. And it's basically the decline of a family. And I love these family sagas and declines of families, etc. So it's supposed to be one of the greatest novels of 20th century Japan. So that you have like three great authors that wrote at the same time in Japan. So Tanizaki was one of them, and obviously Mishima was another one. So Mishima's a bit more well known nowadays. And then you have Kawabata, who won the Nobel Prize. And I've read Kawabata. I've read a few novels of his. I haven't read Mishima yet, but well, actually, no, that's not true. I read his No Theater plays, but I didn't read any novel of him. But I'm also planning to do that. But I think the Makioka sisters is kind of like the one that has the most mystique out of these various authors for me, out of their books. And so it's kind of like the one that I'm most looking forward to. But it's also a bit of a longer one. Then we move to another completely different place. This is River of Fire by Qurratulain Hyder. So she was an Indian author who wrote in Urdu, one of the various languages of northern India and also of Pakistan. And this was written in 1959. And it's basically an epic that tackles the whole of Indian story, or the story of the Indian subcontinent from the Maurya Empire up until the present day in her time, so partition and the time after partition. It's considered a masterpiece of Urdu fiction. The blurb here at the back says it's the 100 Years of Solitude for Urdu fiction. So that's quite high praise. It's supposed to be it's an influential work in Urdu, apparently, from these various blurbs, etc., because it introduces some techniques from Western literature into Urdu, which hadn't been present in Urdu literature at that time. So especially the modernist type literatures from kind of like Virginia Woolf, etc., and mixes it or like infuses them with the Urdu traditions and then the poets in the Urdu language, and to create basically this piece. I think we would probably call it a maximalist type of piece, at least from the ambition. It sounds like it. That's all I know about it. However, what actually got me to get interested in this is another piece of Urdu fiction that I read last year. Purely by chance, I got it. And that was The Women's Courtyard by Khatija Mastoor, a Pakistani author that also wrote in Urdu. And she tackled the Indian partition in her book, in this book, and it's quite a haunting book because all of it takes place in the women's courtyard. So you follow a girl that then becomes a young lady, and the whole story of the partition is filtered through what she hears when people talk about it in this women's courtyard. So it's very claustrophobic. I think it might actually be one of the most claustrophobic novels I've ever read, because you never leave actually these courtyards. I mean, you sometimes move from house to house, but each time you stay in this courtyard, and all you get is what is discussed in this courtyard. Sometimes you have the men that want to talk about politics, and then they move out to another room, and so you don't know what they're talking about, and you kind of like have to piece together what's happening in the outside world just by these various things that are discussed in this women's courtyard. Then my fifth fiction book that I haven't read yet, but I want to read, and I consider it already canonical, is one that I have started to read, but I haven't finished, and I abandoned at the time. And I think some of these books, some of these canonical books that take a little bit more of your attention, sometimes you just need to realize when you start reading them and you can't really get through them, that maybe it's not the right time yet to read them. And for me, one of those books is actually the Book of Disquiet by Fernando Pessoa, the famous Portuguese writer. I did a Poetry Thursday about him this week, so I'll link to that as well below. And this is, of course, his very famous novel, if we can call it that, because actually what it was the following. Pessoa died in 1935. He had been talking to his friends about this big novel that he wanted to write, but when he died and they looked at his his papers, what they basically found was like this huge trunk, and the trunk was filled with thousands of little snippets of paper, and that was the novel. And so different scholars of Pessoa then took decades to actually try to piece it together into a novel. It was first published in Portugal in 1982. And then it was criticized by scholars that thought, well, no, I would have pieced it together differently. And so you have, in the meantime, had several editions of it. This version here is the edition by Richard Zenith, who also translated it into English. But this is actually the Portuguese version. So he pieced together a new Portuguese version in 1998. So this is the edition of 1998. And then he also translated his own version into English. So I'm got like 20% done the first time I tried to read it. And I really loved the writing. So I think I mentioned it in my poetry video. For me, he is the best writer in Portuguese ever. But it's tough going because it is so fragmentary. It's really just, you could almost think of it as a series of diary entries, but that got mixed up, where basically maybe the diary was written in sole sheets of paper, and then the wind blew them out, and then you just have to kind of like trying to piece them together again. It's very melancholic. It's in a way, at least from the parts that I read, so the first 20% is probably the most Portuguese book that anyone could ever write, because you just have this melancholy that is supposedly said to be part of the Portuguese soul. That's just imbuing this whole work. It's a very melancholic work, but it's also amazingly written. So I'm looking forward at some point to actually get to read the Book of Disquiet in full. And then last but not least, for my non-fiction canonical book that I look forward to read, it's this one here. It's actually a recommendation by Steve Donoghue when I asked him about what book on Byzantine history he could recommend. And so he recommended this one here by Anthony Caldelis, The New Roman Empire, and was published very recently in 2023. But as you can see, it's quite an undertaking. Sorry. But I quite look forward to it because, sorry, I think Byzantium is one of those empires or kingdoms that for a long time was just ignored by Western historiography. You had very few books that actually looked at it. And it's only recently, I would say probably in the past 20 years, that more attention has been given to the Byzantine Empire. Funnily enough, also if those of you that are gamers and that might be looking at the soon to come Europa Universalis 5 and his predecessors Europa Universalis 4, you will know that Byzantium is kind of like the one kingdom that everybody wants to play, just because you want to prevent the fall of Byzantium to the Ottomans. So from a video game perspective, it's obviously a very interesting premise. But beyond that, I think it was just kind of like ignored, just because obviously Byzantium had less of an impact on, you know, Western Europe than the Western Roman Empire. And so from that historiographical perspective, Rome just ended in the 5th century, and that was it. And then you follow the kingdoms of the Franks, and then the Angles and Saxons, etc. And the so it was for a long time quite difficult to actually find anything on Byzantium. The one I did come across in the past was this one here by Judith Herrin, called Byzantium, and I read this one various times. It's actually quite good. It's just very short. So it has kind of like 360, 370 pages or so. And for an empire that actually spanned 1,000 years, it's a very short history. And because it's very short, obviously Judith Herrin, she just has to kind of like jump from milestone to milestone, because else, you know, how would you actually treat the whole history? But because of that, there's just like some bits that are missing and that feel that they are missing. That's why I'm actually quite looking forward to this one here, which is obviously much bigger, but that hopefully will then also provide more of this in between. So what happened? So why did we move from the iconoclasts or whatever to, I don't know, Basil, the slayer of the Bulgars? Just to cite two of those episodes, and how, you know, how did Byzantium overall evolve as an empire? So that's why at some point I will read this, and I'll do someday a video about history books and what for me makes really good history books and what doesn't, because not all of them are good, and some of them, let's say, focus on the wrong things, at least for a lay audience. Because I mean, let's be fair. I mean, I am a lay audience. I'm not a historian. So I am interested in history, but still, if I read an introductory book about Byzantium like this one, you need to take me along and you know, not assume that I know a bunch of stuff, or you know, you have to, for instance, give me the list of the various emperors that reigned, even if you don't go into detail on each of them. But at least I need this chronological sequence to be able to understand it. And then you can dive deeper into certain subjects. But some history books, they just do the deep dives into the subjects that their author is interested in, but they don't give me the chronological timeline, so kind of like the bare bones of what happened in the history of that nation. And those are the kind of history books I don't really like so much. Anyway, that was it. 12 books from my personal canon. Some I've read, some I haven't read. Let me know what you think about those, and see you next time, BookTube. Thank you.